Thank you. I'm Sanjeev Goyal. I'm the chair of the economics faculty, and it's my great pleasure to welcome you all to the Marshall Lectures of 2017-2018. Professor Carolyn Hoxby is Scott and Donia Professor of Economics at Stanford University. She's also the director of the Economics of Education program at the NBER and a senior fellow at the Hoover Institute at Stanford. She has an undergraduate degree from Harvard, an MPhil degree from Oxford, and she obtained a PhD from MIT. She taught at Harvard University before moving to Stanford in 2007. Carolyn is one of the world's leading experts on the economics of education. She has made fundamental contributions to our understanding of central questions in education. For instance, how does the class size of a school affect pupil performance? How does competition among public schools affect the quality of the schools and performance of the students? What is the size of peer effects in education? In her recent project, Expanding College Opportunities, she studies the persistent problem of limited enrollment of children from disadvantaged background to elite institutions and more generally institutions of higher learning. She began in this project by showing that low-income high achievers usually do not apply to selective colleges. This is in spite of clear evidence that they are extremely likely to get admission at those institutions and moreover, receive generous financial assistance. So the puzzle was, why were they not applying to these institutions? And we at Cambridge, of course, are familiar with this challenge. We have many initiatives in the university to deal with this. So Carolyn's work directly addresses this problem, and her work, her large-scale experimental work, demonstrates that fairly low-cost informational interventions can make a material difference in the rate of applications to higher education institutions. More broadly, she's continuing in this line of work to look at how universities function and how they can better use their resources to expand access to higher education more broadly in society. Professor Hoxby is well known as an inspiring teacher and has been the recipient of several honors, including the highest honor given at Stanford to a teacher, the John and Lydia Pierce Mitchell University Fellowship. And so in addition, she's also received many other awards as an inspiring teacher. The Marshall Lectures were started in 1946. They are the oldest public lectures of this faculty. They are also the most significant public lectures of the Faculty of Economics. These lectures are aimed at our undergraduates. It is therefore only fitting that we have today a distinguished teacher and an expert in education to talk to us. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming the 2017-18 Marshall Lecturer, Carolyn Hoxby.
Thank you for that kind and generous introduction, and thank you all for welcoming me to the University of Cambridge today. I am honored to be giving the Alfred Marshall Lectures. When I was an undergraduate, I took a class in the history of economic thought. I was an undergraduate at Harvard, but it was taught by a fellow from Oxford, and it was one of the greatest classes I took, and the best book that I read was Marshall. So I'm sort of thrilled to be here today to give a lecture or lectures named after Alfred Marshall, who was indeed just a mind-blowingly great economist. So I'm happy about that. Okay, what I'm going to be talking about today and tomorrow in the Marshall Lectures is taking productivity in education seriously. The two lectures are closely related to one another, and you will see that when you get to the end of this lecture, you should feel a bit uncomfortable about where we are going tomorrow. And I hope that you feel a sense of mild discomfort combined with urgency, and that's sort of the plan of action for the two lectures. Today I'm going to be talking about higher education, and tomorrow I'm going to be talking more about primary and secondary education. So they're quite different talks, but they are closely related to one another. Okay, so let's get going. Gary Becker is usually associated with the seminal model of human capital. Let me just remind you of that model. That model suggests that human capital, or some function of it, like earnings, permanent earnings, lifetime earnings, something like that, is a dependent variable in the model. And on the right-hand side of that function are two main elements. You could also have other things, but the two main elements are schooling, that's S sub I, and ability or cognitive skill, which is A sub I. And from very early on, this has been the workhorse model of human capital formation. I'm going to run you through more of what the model predicts in a moment, but that's the basic Becker human capital model that almost everyone follows in some way. The production function that I just described has, right from Becker, been thought or assumed to exhibit single crossing in schooling and cognitive skill. So what is single crossing? In this particular application, it means that the cross-partial derivative of schooling and ability is greater than 0, okay? At least for all positive levels of schooling, and no one knows what negative levels of schooling would be in any case, okay? All right, so that cross-partial derivative is going to be quite important and is a lot of what we are going to be thinking about today, not just its sign, that it's greater than 0, but its magnitude. So let me give you a preview of the two lectures and hope to interest you in why it is that we need lecture 2 and not just lecture 1. In this lecture, what I'm going to be doing is showing you a lot of empirical evidence that suggests that in higher education, so by that I mean tertiary education, it isn't necessarily university education, it could be other forms of tertiary education, but think university education. In higher education, single crossing is not just an important condition, but it's very big in magnitude, it's strong in magnitude, that the cross-partial derivative between schooling and ability is big, okay? Why is this consequential? It means that people who are of higher cognitive skill when they enter university can absorb a lot more educational resources and still be about as productive with $1 or £1 of educational resources as someone who is of lower cognitive skill and goes to a university with lower educational resources. This is a very consequential result, not only for thinking about productivity in higher education, but also for thinking about what is optimal investment in higher education, and finally for thinking about how income equality or inequality would play out as advanced economies move to having more and more of their population potentially engaging or needing to engage in higher education. So I'm going to end with some worries at the end of this lecture about the consequences of this result for income equality. Right? The second lecture is going to essentially take a step back and say, well, is there something we could do about the fact that cognitive skill seems so important in determining educational productivity in higher education? Are we just doomed to a world in which people with high levels of cognitive skill get a lot of educational resources, people with low levels of cognitive skill get very few educational resources, and then we end up with very unequal incomes, which we would have to remedy by some form of redistribution through the tax or social insurance systems? It says, well, perhaps we ought to take the education production function a little bit more seriously and try to understand how ability or cognitive skill is created. And in particular, I'm going to draw on recent neuroscience from, say, the past decade, which is really a big change from the neuroscience that, say, 20 years ago, something like that, and argue that neuroscience is correct to direct our attention towards early adolescence, which is a time when the brain is unusually plastic and when educational interventions can have a more determinative effect on someone's long-run outcomes than interventions that we make at other times of life. And I will talk about this with reference to the early childhood literature as well. And you'll see I differentiate quite strongly between the arguments that I'm making and the evidence that I'm going to show you and that other body of thought. Okay, so that's a preview of the two lectures. And in some sense, the second lecture should help us feel better about the first lecture, because the second lecture suggests that maybe everyone could have a relatively high level of cognitive skill. Okay, the human capital model doesn't say only some people get to have it. It just says, if you have it, what sort of education investment should you make? Okay, so before I get myself into all sorts of difficulties, that's my telephone. Before I get myself into all sorts of difficulties, let me define what I mean by cognitive skill. So economists have traditionally been actually fairly loose or free with their use of words that are related to one another. Cognitive skill, aptitude, ability, mental readiness. I sometimes use the words college readiness to describe where someone is beginning university. Productivity, even used by labor economists, often means something that's very closely related to these other words. So we use all of these words, partly because we aren't neuroscientists, so we don't have very precise definitions of these things, but also because what we meant was not something that was necessarily genetically determined or determined by the environment, but just something that was the expected treatment effect of giving you education that pushed you at the margin, okay, in terms of the skills that you would produce with that education. That's really what we mean. When we say someone is of higher cognitive skill, what we mean is that they somehow bring a package to the educational setting, to the university, which makes them better able to absorb a university education, and therefore they get more out of it, all else equal. Okay, so if you want to call that cognitive skill, that's fine. If you want to call it ability, that's fine. Aptitude, it really doesn't matter to me. Okay, I just want to make it clear that it is not genetically endowed ability alone. Becker, when he wrote down his model of human capital formation, he made the two elements in it, schooling and ability, but he wasn't really interested in neuroscience. In fact, I knew Gary Becker quite well before he died, and I'm quite sure it had nothing to do with neuroscience. Instead, he just observed that people who had high cognitive skill or people who were of higher ability tended to get more education, and so that was made an assumption in the model because it helped the model fit the data. That is essentially why it's there in the model. It was based on trying to make the model fit the data. Now, that sort of loose way of thinking about cognitive skill or ability has a good side, and I would say the good side is that economists of education and economists more generally have been so willing to consider different models of skill and ability that we've been very open to differences in how this thing is defined, and that turns out to be somewhat justified by neuroscience, as you will see in the lecture of tomorrow, where I talk about what neuroscience tells us about the formation of ability, and you will see that you shouldn't have a very static or fixed concept of it, because that's just not likely to be where the science is. Okay? The bad thing about the use of the word ability in the original Becker model was that people assumed that because the word ability was used, that necessarily this thing about people was a fixed or predetermined thing. And people have taken that assumption fairly seriously as they have made this model work for them. I'm going to tell you that's probably not a good assumption. In this lecture, how cognitive skill arises is really not going to matter much. And the reason it's not going to matter is that I'm going to take every student as he or she enters higher education as kind of a given package of cognitive skills and other things like that, and I'm not going to worry how he or she got there. But in the next lecture, I will worry about how cognitive skill arises. So that gives you a sense of where we're going. I'm just going to use the word cognitive skill and ability interchangeably because they tend to be used interchangeably in the literature. But you might say, well, now you haven't defined it at all. What is cognitive skill? Well, it is something that's reasonably well defined. It's the capacity for succeeding in cognitive tasks in which your brain's frontal lobe plays a disproportionate role. And so those are tasks that involve reasoning, planning, integration of knowledge, and self-regulation. For instance, patience is something that develops in your frontal lobe, or your ability to put off rewards. So it's not true that these capacities are unrelated to anything else that goes on in your brain. They're not. They are not independent of knowledge. So it's not the case that you could have cognitive skills if you never had been asked to learn anything. It turns out that you really can't. Okay? Cognitive skills are not independent of training. They are intertwined with your emotional and social skills. We're going to learn tomorrow about how the front lobe of your brain gets wired into the back lobe of your brain a bit. Okay? The back lobes. Nevertheless, these skills are somewhat distinct, and they are particularly useful in formal education. So everyone would probably agree that reasoning, planning, integration of knowledge, self-regulation are all skills that are disproportionately useful in formal education. So that's what I mean by cognitive skill. Okay, so let me tell you where we're going in this lecture. I'm going to very quickly review Becker's workhorse model of human capital formation so that we remember the result that if people invest optimally in human capital, then what we should observe is that the marginal productivity of educational resources is the same across people of different levels of cognitive skill. What will differ among them is not the marginal return to a unit of educational resources, but instead the level of educational resources that they get. So I'll show you that in a figure in a moment. That's going to be driven by the single crossing condition. Then I'm going to show you some historical and other descriptive evidence that shows that when markets drive human capital investments, they tend to drive educational resources into a strong allocative matching with higher cognitive skills. In other words, people with higher cognitive skills will generally end up with more educational resources, and that's going to be a very strong tendency in the data. That's going to give me a problem for measuring productivity of higher education institutions because there's going to be an enormous selection problem. The sort of student who ends up at Cambridge has higher cognitive skill on average than the sort of student who does not. How do I deal with that if I'm trying to measure the university's productivity? That is the soul of this lecture. It's the sort of meat and potatoes of this lecture. And I'm going to be talking about a method that at least I find plausible for generating estimates that have tackled selection. And then I'm finally going to interpret the evidence for you and suggest that the evidence indicates that markets are not crazy, but rather that single crossing is just very powerful in higher education. And at that point, we'll have some worrisome implications for the economy. All right, so let me just remind you of the Becker model and the key role of single crossing. So this is a classic graph from the Becker model. On the horizontal axis, I have educational resources. On the vertical axis, I have human capital, which is a function of education resources and ability or cognitive skill. And you'll notice here that I'm now using educational resources and I'm not using S. And the reason is that it's not, for higher education, it's not years of schooling that really matters. It's the level of educational resources that you experience. So you might experience 1,000 pounds worth or 2,000 pounds or 10,000 pounds or more, okay? But it's not the years, it's more the level of resources that you experience. Now, I have drawn two production functions here, one for a high ability person, one for a low ability person, and they exhibit single crossing. In this case, they cross at the origin. What do I mean when they exhibit single crossing? Well, remember that cross partial derivative, okay, between educational resources and ability? That in this graph means that if I take any vertical line up from the horizontal axis, any vertical line, I will always find that the red line for the high ability person has a steeper slope than the green line for the low ability person. That is the graphical interpretation of that single crossing condition. If you want to see the cross, that's where it occurs, at the origin, in the particular example that I drew. Okay, so they do cross exactly once. I could have them cross higher up on the vertical axis. This would be the case in which even if I have no educational resources whatsoever in my experience, I still have some human capital that I might just, pick up through life, okay? All right, so, but they would still cross only once. And these two curves also obey single crossing. All right, so if we have single crossing in the Becker model, what does the Becker model predict? It says that if there is an efficient capital market, or if there is a social planner who can do this through social planner magic, okay? An efficient capital market would set the marginal return to educational resources equal across all ability types, cognitive skill types. And that comes out of it, just very simple thinking. I have some other type of investment I could make. I could invest in a machine. I could invest in financial markets. I could do something else with my dollar, okay? Or I could invest more in education, and I ought to keep investing in education as long as my internal rate of return in education is higher than what I could earn outside. And once it becomes equal to what I could earn in some alternative form of investment, I should stop investing. This will drive everyone, or would drive everyone with an efficient capital market to have this same marginal return to educational resources. So that last dollar of educational resources would generate the same increase in human capital. Note that this is in the absence of any sort of spillovers, frictions in the capital market, and so forth. So this is not quite the way the real world works. And in fact, a lot of what economists of education do is worry about the world in which there are spillovers and frictions and other things like that, and why it is that we don't necessarily see the world look like the Becker model. Okay? But that is what the Becker model predicts. Okay, if you have that model of the world, and you have efficient capital markets, making everyone make optimal investment in human capital, what you're going to see is that although the high and low cognitive skill people both have the same marginal return to a unit of educational resources, the high ability person is going to invest in more educational resources than the low ability person. And that is because of single crossing. And the stronger that single crossing condition is, the bigger is that cross-partial derivative between educational resources and ability, the further apart the amounts of educational resources these two people are going to want to invest in. Okay, so for instance, if I drew the lines like this, these are also two curves that satisfy single crossing, right? The red line always has a higher slope than the green line, but the differences in slopes are now small. You'll notice that the difference in the educational resources that the people decide to invest in should be also quite small. Okay, so it's not just the sign of that cross partial that matters, it's also the magnitude. Interestingly, with this graph, we can also read off the average productivity. So I showed you how to read off the marginal productivity of educational resources. Those are the red straight line and the green straight line. We can also read off the average productivity of educational resources by drawing a line through, in this case, the origin. Okay, that's where the two production functions cross. And say the dark purple line tells us, well, we gave this much educational resources to the high ability person, and this was how much his human capital was increased by those educational resources. So it must be the case that the slope of that dark purple line is the average productivity of those educational resources. And the slope of the lavender colored line is the average productivity for the low cognitive skill person. Okay? All right, so that's the Becker model, just to remind you. Marginal productivity of educational resources, average productivity of educational resources, optimal investments in human capital, you've got it all. All right, so now why should you be interested in US higher education? Well, I wouldn't say you should be interested in US higher education for its own sake, because you're not going to U.S. higher education, at least at this point, okay? You might for graduate school or something like that, but you don't have to be interested in it for its own sake. Be interested in it because unlike virtually any other country in the world, U.S. higher education exhibits a very strong market, okay? It is really, truly, I live in this world, it is a market. I'm at one of the most elite institutions in the United States, and we still compete every day. And we don't just compete with our near peers, we compete with all the other institutions, and every decision we make is based on market forces to some extent. This is unusual, and it's because essentially so much of the market is private, particularly at the more selective end. Okay, I'm going to show you evidence on this. So it's a very informative market for economic analysis because the prices and the educational resources and things like that are not set by some central government, not at all. They are essentially set autonomously by each university as it tries to make decisions to respond to the market. Okay, so that's why you should be interested in U.S. higher education, because it sort of reveals things about the education production function and what's going on. And even if you don't care about the U.S. at all, you should still care about the education production function, because the same education production function probably is working here as is working in the U.S. You might not be able to see it as easily. Okay? All right. So this market exhibits strong variation, which is highly correlated with selectivity. As I'm going to show you in a moment, at the highly selective end of the spectrum, the market is very integrated. It's nationally integrated. It's very competitive. It's relatively well-informed. Students understand the universities that they're choosing reasonably well. Students understand, schools understand who the students are out there, whom they could recruit. Okay? It's largely privately financed in the sense that students are actually paying for their own education and it's not running through the tax system. Okay? And the students who are choosing among the selective institutions in the United States are quite elastic with respect to institutions' academic and other resources. So they're not just choosing the institution that their father chose or their mother chose or the nearest one or something like that. We're going to see evidence that they're not doing that. Okay, at the other end of the selectivity spectrum, in other words, the non-selective institutions or open enrollment institutions, they're often called, there are somewhat opposite conditions. I'm not going to be talking a lot about that set of schools today, but I'm very happy to answer questions about them if we ever get a chance to get to those institutions. Okay, so let me review something about the US market just so that you know how things work. We have about 7,500 post-secondary institutions in the United States, which is a great many. It includes famous institutions that you probably know, like Harvard or Yale or something like that, but it also includes many institutions which, believe me, you would not recognize. Okay, so, and there are a good 5,000 of those, right? So many, many institutions are not recognizable. We have three different types of governance: public or state-controlled institutions, nonprofit institutions, which tend to dominate the most selective end of the spectrum, and for-profit institutions, most of which are at the very non-selective or open enrollment end of the spectrum, so I'm not going to be talking about the for-profit institutions very much today. The institutions have great autonomy. They get to choose their own tuition, their application requirements, their students, their faculty, curriculum, salaries, financial aid, or what grants they're going to give out, whether they're going to give out loans, how to give out loans, and how to raise money from donors. That's very important for nonprofits, where alumni, as I will explain in a moment, pay for a lot of the cost of the university. Or investors if they're for-profits. That's not so relevant to us today. By international standards, even our public institutions, say the University of California at Berkeley, which is near me, is a very autonomous university. It is a state-controlled university, but it sets its own tuition. It sets its own admission standards. Its professors get paid whatever Berkeley can pay them, okay? And so forth. It has a lot of autonomy by international standards, even though it is a state-controlled university. And we could even get into why I think that's true, but that's all you need to know for this. Now, the selective schools admit students on a holistic basis. That means they try to look at the whole student as an individual and not just admit on the basis of one particular criterion. But the thing that is most powerful in admissions are college aptitude scores. So there's no national curriculum in the United States, so there is no real equivalent of the A-levels or the O-levels or anything like that. So we don't give college tests that are based on a particular curriculum. Instead, there's a college aptitude test. The most common one is the SAT, okay? And it is designed to be curricularly somewhat independent. It is actually quite a good predictor of how well you're going to perform in university. When I say that a college is more selective, I mean that it has higher median or mean SAT scores. Okay, so from now on, everything will just be about how high a school's SAT scores are. In the United States, the net tuition of a school, which is how much the student actually pays, is different than the list tuition, or the sort of list price. Think of it as like the sticker price on a car. And that's different again from the educational resources that a student experiences. The difference between net and list tuition is grants, other forms of financial aid. And the difference between educational resources and list tuition is state appropriations for the public institutions and gifts from alumni and other donors for the private institutions. It's important to understand that although the most selective schools in the United States have list tuition that would seem very high to you probably, so $65,000 a year, $75,000 a year would not be unusual. They have high list tuition. They also have very high resources, but they do a lot of price discrimination on the basis of family income, so they are free for low-income students, and they subsidize tuition for all students. So even a student who pays the list tuition at Stanford is paying less than half of the cost of his or her education. How does this work? It works because in expectation, they will pay for their own educations by giving back when they are in their 50s and 60s and 70s as alumni. And that is actually how these institutions stay afloat. I realize it seems like an unlikely model of financing, but it seems to work. Okay. All right. We have federal intervention through portable grants and things like that. The way I want you to think about U.S. post-secondary education is it's a market. It has price distortions, but a lot of it is functioning in a pretty market-like sort of way. So think of it like that. All right. Let me just review a little bit of history to give you a sense of what you should be looking for as we move forward in the evidence. Okay, so I'm going to describe what the U.S. higher education used to look like as autarky. Everyone just went to his or her local college or university, to integration, which is how I think about the market now. Okay, so what's the history? We had near autarky in the 19th century. In fact, we didn't have very good universities at all in the 19th century. People just went to whatever was their local school. The market became more and more geographically integrated, especially for high ability or high cognitive skill students, and most of this took place after World War II, and that's essentially because information about both students and institutions improved dramatically with the advent of modern testing, which could be scored by computers and things like that. As the market became more integrated, students with high cognitive skills tended to more and more attend institutions with the most resources per student. So students started to be much more interested in attending the school that looked like it had the most resources that they could get into. That looks like how they started to make their choices and paid much less attention to distance. Since the students could not necessarily pay for all of these resources up front, the way the allocation between educational resources and cognitive skill was achieved was through this odd system that I talked about, where students received large subsidies at the time of their enrollment. They weren't paying for most of their education, but they eventually paid it back as alumni. In some other papers, I call this the venture capital model of universities, because it's like a university has a portfolio of students whom it admits every year, and it takes a tiny equity stake in each one of those students, okay? And all you have to do is have one Bill Gates in your class, and that tiny equity stake pays off really well, okay? So, and that is how it works. That is truly how it works. So, you just have to have 2 students, like Bill Gates in a Harvard class, they're fine. All right, so now, let's look at these more integrated markets for higher education. So that's 1950, here's 2010. This is the percentage of students who apply to a post-secondary institution that's at least 250 miles distant from their home. The high aptitude students are in Navy. The median aptitude students are in green, and students who are marginally prepared for university, which means we think they're really going to fail in their first year, are in red. They still go to university largely in the United States, that being part of our fascinating way of dealing with education. But you can see that the most able students, or the highest cognitive skill students, they're applying more and more to universities that are far away from their homes. They're just not that sensitive to distance. If I do statistical models of post-secondary school choice using longitudinal data from the United States, what I will find is that distance is decreasing in importance over time, that the match between the student's own ability and her peers' ability or her classmates' ability at the university is increasing in importance over time, and parents' ability to pay for the educational resources is decreasing in importance over time. And that's essentially because really the educational resources are being paid by the future earnings of the students at that school. All of these changes are much more dramatic for students with high ability, high cognitive skill. Okay, so that's a little bit of evidence on that. Let me just show you some of the subsidies at the time of enrollment. This is only up to 2007, and it's kept accelerating to this day. It's from an older paper of mine. That's 1967 at the far left, 2007 at the far right. I've categorized institutions here by how selective they were in 1962. So they all stay in the same category over time, right? Harvard was very selective in 1962. It's still very selective today, and I've kept it on the same line. But if it had changed, I still would have kept it on the most selective line. All right, what you will see is that, subsidies for the students have been going up at all institutions, but notice that they have been particularly going up for students who are in the 99th percentile, okay? Keep track of this. In 2007, the average subsidy per student of a student going to a 99th percentile school was about $75,000 per year. Okay, that's not over 4 years, that's per year. Right? And today, it's closer to $100,000, okay? That's a little shy of $100,000, okay? And the schools that are in this 99th percentile are some that you will have heard of, so Harvard, Princeton, Yale, Stanford, MIT, Caltech, University of Chicago, places like that, okay? The subsidy is also going up a lot for other schools that are highly selective, but not quite so much, okay? All right. By the way, what is a subsidy per student? It's the difference between academic spending and how much the student actually pays in tuition. And what is in academic spending? It's instructional services, paying for your instructors, okay, teaching you, student services, and academic support. It does not include things like expenditures on research, public service, medical hospitals, other things like labs, things like that are often associated with universities as well. Okay. Then finally, I'm going to show you how much more sortatively matched students are now than they were back in 1967. So they're matched much more now to educational resources. This is 1967. What I have done is I took every student in 1967 and I simply ranked the students from the students with the highest scores on the college aptitude test to the students with the lowest score. Okay, so they're just in rank order. And then I ranked institutions on their per student instructional resources, ranking them from the schools that had the most per student to the schools with the least. So again, just rank order. And I allocated each school the number of seats that it actually has to get this right. Okay, in 1967, you can see that there wasn't that much of a relationship between how high aptitude a student was, or what his college readiness was, and the resources that he or she received. This is pretty flat with the, you can see there's a bit of a pattern here. So that there's more educational resources if you're higher aptitude, but not until you get into this set of schools that has quite a lot of educational resources. Okay, so that's 1967. Here's the same graph for 2013. Okay? You can see that as market pressure increased, what happened was that assortative matching between the educational resources and students' cognitive skills increased dramatically. There still isn't much matching going on among these non-selective schools down here, but there's a lot of matching elsewhere. Just to give you a sense of how Americans think about these different schools, these are the most selective schools. They're all nonprofits. These are very selective schools. These are literally categories that Americans use. Very selective schools, and these are all the non-selective schools. Okay? So you can see that there's tremendous increase in assortative matching. Now, I just showed you a bit of history. Let me tell you a bit about the US post-secondary market today. I may skip some of these slides, but I just want to give you a taste for how different these markets are in terms of educational resources and integration, information, things like that. This slide is very important for you to understand. This is a core student and instructional resources per student in a recent year, 2013-14, by the institution selectivity. So I'm going to show you a lot of charts that look like this, and I want you to understand how they work. On the horizontal axis is the institutions, okay, it's not the students, it's the institutions' median SAT math and verbal score in 20-point categories. So I have put each institution into a bin that depends on its median SAT math and verbal score. So that's sort of the way we tend to rank schools in the United States. And then some form of dollars is always going to be on the vertical axis. Okay, so what can we see here? The most selective institutions in the United States are the ones that are far to the right. The least selective institutions are ones that are far to the left. Okay. The institutions that are the most selective in the United States in 2013-14 were spending on average more than $150,000 per student per year. Okay, that was what's called core student resources, which includes student services, academic support, and institutional support. If you just look at instructional spending, so this is just spending on professors and other instructors, it was still just under $100,000. Okay, so lots and lots and lots of money is being spent at these institutions. And since I've been at them my whole life, I can tell you we do spend this amount of money. It's kind of disturbing, but it's true. Weird, but true. Okay, and then down at the low end of selectivity, you can see that not inconsiderable dollars are being spent per pupil, but it's more like $10,000. Okay. So there's an order of magnitude difference between the most selective and the least selective institutions in the United States in how much spending students are experiencing. I think I'm going to skip the next slides because I think I've talked enough about these ideas and get on to the meat of the paper. I want to measure the productivity of post-secondary institutions, and you should already be able to tell that this is going to be very difficult to do. Why is it going to be hard to do? It's because some institutions are very, very selective, and they have these very able students. So I can't just assume that because they have good outcomes afterwards, they wouldn't have had those good outcomes in the first place. That might not be this school's value added. That might just be that they were going to earn that amount anyway. So what I'm going to try to do is measure the causal effect on outcomes of attending an institution. That's going to be the numerator, which I will call value added, the causal increase in lifetime earnings triggered by enrolling in the institution. And for the denominator, I'm going to try to measure the causal increase in lifetime educational spending that's triggered by enrolling in the institution. I'm going to call this social investment because it isn't necessarily all paid up front by the student, but it is all invested in the student's education. So just think of it as all the money that's spent on a student's education. And the problem that I'm going to deal with is bias from vertical selection, which is the main problem, and horizontal selection. Vertical selection is that some schools enroll students who are higher in ability than others. Horizontal selection matters quite a bit in the United States too for a different reason. It's largely geography. Some schools enroll students who are like on ability, but they differ on geography, costs of living, stuff like that. So if you're enrolling students in Mississippi, that is different than enrolling students in New York State or something like that, where the labor markets and costs of living are quite different. Okay, so those are the two forms of selection I'm going to try to remedy. Let me give you a sense of what the method is, and then I'll give you some intuition into how it works econometrically. So I'm going to deal with vertical selection by finding each school's on the bubble range in admission. So what does on the bubble mean? Actually, I think it's also in the Cambridge Dictionary, not just American dictionaries. An on the bubble region is where we're just not sure whether to admit this student or not to admit this student. Okay? And people often use on the bubble, say, to refer to whether someone's going to make a national football team or something like that. He's just on the bubble, okay? So that's the idea. We're going to treat those as experiments where college A or University A versus University B, where College B is just a little bit less selective than University A, because the students are just on the bubble between those two types of universities. I'm going to deal with horizontal selection by finding students choosing among colleges that are in an indifferent set. In other words, they're very, very similar in selectivity on vertical grounds. And where I'm going to treat the students as flipping a coin between them. So a good example would be Yale and Princeton. They're almost identical in selectivity. They're really not all that different as institutions. And so I don't know how students choose among them, but coin flipping would not be a terrible idea. So I'm going to treat those as experiments where universities A and C have very similar students, and somehow students end up at one versus the other. Okay, and I'm going to look at their difference in outcomes. And then I'm going to use paired comparison methods. This is a statistical method to combine the results of all the pairwise experiments to obtain the value added in social investment that is as free from selection bias as possible. So let me give you just a little bit more of a taste of how this method works. More on the vertical experiments. In the US, staff do admissions in a fairly systematic way. We have admission staffs for universities. They're heavily influenced by academic criteria, especially those college aptitude scores. They review a pool of students. They sort of pre-admit some students based on what they see in the application. They then sort of set aside a pool of students who would be fine, but not, not special, okay? And they look at those students and they say, well, those are our on-the-bubble students. How do we round out the class? We want to have some students from Ohio, so let's choose some on-the-bubble students who are from Ohio. Let's choose some on-the-bubble students who are going to play in the student orchestra. Let's make sure that we've ended up with a class that seems like what we're looking for. And so you can think of them as almost flipping coins within this group of students who are on the bubble. And what I do to find the bubble range for each and every university in the US is use structural break methods to find out where, if I look at all the data that they feed into their university applications, where do I see a structural break in the probability of being admitted? Okay, so that's the vertical experiments, and those are the important ones. The horizontal experiments are very simple because, as I said, it's kind of like the Yale versus Princeton example. Students might as well be flipping a coin. I'm going to treat those experiments as, like, for instance, Yale had good weather on the day they visited and it was raining in Princeton or something like that. That, you couldn't possibly have your lifetime outcomes affected by that, but your college choice could be affected by that, okay? And I'm going to identify schools as horizontal equals if their test score distributions are extremely similar. And for there, I'm not going to be looking at on-the-bubble students. I'm going to be looking at students who could easily get into both institutions and kind of just have to choose between them. Okay, so those are my horizontal experiments. I need to combine all these head-to-head experiments, and I'm going to use these paired comparison methods. So why do I do this? It's for two reasons. First of all, there's a lot of information that you get by combining both types of experiments. Also, we're discarding information if we don't cross-validate each experiment against all of the others. So I've given you an example there. Let's say that we see both Yale and Princeton, how much their students' outcomes differ from a university that they both play pretty often in tournaments. That might be, say, Trinity, okay, slightly less selective university, but still very selective university. If I saw that they both had improvements in value added relative to Trinity that were very similar, I would then expect that when I saw differences in their outcomes across students choosing between Princeton and Yale, their outcomes should also be very similar. That's a form of cross-validation, okay? It doesn't have to be true, but it's a useful way to cross-validate the experiments. Just for some notes on the implementation, I'm using administrative data for the entire population of the United States, college-going students. I have their actual data from the Treasury on earnings. I know their test scores, their applications, where they enrolled, the educational resources they experienced, and so forth, okay? So there isn't really very much estimating things in this paper, except for the fact that I only have their earnings data up to age 32 and I project it thereafter. I've also had some other papers that look at productivity based on other outcomes, but today we're just going to look at earnings. Just to give you a sense of how the paired comparison methods work, I'm just going to give you a tiny bit of intuition into the statistics or econometrics without going into it in too much detail. So you all know that we would like to have a ranking of all the tennis players in the world, right? But they can't all play one another all the time. That's not practical. So we know that, say, Djokovic and Nadal play one another pretty often, and Federer and Nadal play one another pretty often. Those are horizontal tournaments, where they're playing in paired tournaments. There are only a pair of them are playing at a time, and they're very similar players in terms of their level of skill. We also see Djokovic playing the person who's ranked number 40, and the person who's ranked number 40 playing the person who's ranked number 80, and so forth and so on. How do we figure out that Djokovic or Nadal is much more highly ranked than the person who's ranked number 4,000 in men's tennis? Well, actually, it's by taking all of those tournaments and combining them statistically. And then we get a whole ranking, all the way from the top to the bottom. That is the paired comparison method. It's also used for ranking chess players and everything else. This is a perfectly straightforward application of paired comparison methods, although I will say that it takes a really long time to do the computations because I have about 4 million students in each cohort of students. All right, so that's the method that I'm going to use. Just in terms of strengths and weaknesses, most of the selection bias should be eliminated by this method. Common support is always fulfilled. This is very important for me. It means I'm never comparing two students who couldn't get into the same university. I'm never comparing two students who didn't apply to the same university. And there's no form imposed on the relationship between value added and ability. There are some other strengths that I won't go into. There are also some limitations. The main limitation is that all I really learn about is productivity relative to the least selective institutions. In the Becker model, that's sort of saying, if this were the model of the market with 4 institutions, that institution that's the least selective, I'm going to normalize that institution to 0. Okay, and I'm going to compare everything to the least selective institution because I really don't know how to, I know how to compare it to the least selective institution. I don't know how to compare it to people not going to university at all. All right, now for some results in our last minutes. Don't worry, the results are pretty quick. So this is just wage and salary earnings through age 32, discounted to back to age 18, using a 2.5% real discount rate, not a nominal discount rate, with the institution's median math and verbal SAT scores across the bottom. So the same horizontal axis I showed you before, and this is just raw earnings, okay? Raw earnings based on Treasury data. Those are our different types of institutions: most selective, very selective, selective, non-selective. Okay, that is not value added, that's just raw earnings. Now I'm projecting it through age 65. It looks very similar in terms of the pattern. The numbers on the vertical axis are much bigger though. Okay, simply because when I project it to age 65, we have a lot more years of earnings to bring in for people. It doesn't really change the patterns very much though. Now let's say that instead, I don't just have the raw earnings, I estimate value added. So I use my method to eliminate all that selection bias. What do I get? I get something that looks quite different. It doesn't look very different at the bottom end of selectivity, which is not too surprising, because those schools really aren't selecting students in any way. But at the top end of selectivity, you can see that at least half, and something more like 3/5 to 2/3 of raw earnings are really not value added of these institutions. They're just the fact that these are very high ability, high cognitive skill people who would have earned a lot of what they earn just because they are them. Okay, we could have sent them to a very different institution. They would have still earned quite a lot. So getting rid of selection actually does eliminate a lot of the raw earnings differences. Okay, so that's how but it is going up as you go to more selective institutions. Now you might think, oh, I know the answer now. More selective institutions have higher value added. That doesn't tell you about productivity. Why? Because I also told you that these more selective institutions were spending a lot more money. Right? So it isn't just that they have higher value added, but they spent a lot more money to get there. So it's a sort of race between the numerator of productivity, value added, and the denominator of productivity, which is educational resources. So let's see what happens to the educational resources spent on them. This is lifetime social investment. In other words, the lifetime educational resources associated with people who go to these different institutions. And you can see that it is increasing dramatically as we go from the least selective to the most selective institutions. So yes, the value added of these institutions is higher, but they also spent a lot more money to get to that level of value added. So what if I take the numerator, value added, controlling for selection, and I put in it the denominator, lifetime educational resources devoted to the student, and I put that in the denominator, I get this. The average productivity of $1 of social investment. And when I look at this graph, this is kind of what I see. I see, now remember, that's just a normalization there. So I see that among the less selective institutions, there's somewhat lower productivity. I don't want to take a stance on whether it's higher or lower than it ought to be. It's just lower than it is for the more selective institutions. And then it's pretty flat after that. Okay? Maybe it's increasing very slightly, but it certainly does not increase dramatically. Okay, so what does this tell us? It tells us that the average productivity of $1 of educational resources is not that different for the institutions that are very, very selective and the institutions which are only a little bit selective. It is lower for the institutions that are non-selective or open enrollment institutions. Okay, so that's what you ought to get out of that graph. So let's assess where we are. The average productivity of $1 is rather flat, rising just slightly across a fairly wide range of selectivity. This is actually a very striking result because these schools have very different educational resources, and it suggests that resources are somehow scaling up with students' ability so that students who are able to make more productive use of educational resources are getting a lot more educational resources, and somehow that alignment is happening through market forces. Okay? The evidence, by the way, does not suggest that selective schools are maximally productive or anything like that. They could just be similarly inefficient. What it does suggest is that somehow the scaling up is about right. Okay, so there's no easy way to take money from Harvard, give money to a much less selective school, and suddenly have productivity increase on average in the US. Right, so this is what this situation looks approximately like. We have some lower productivity, low selectivity schools. We have a range of somewhat selective schools. They really don't have very different average productivity. All right, I think I told you this. Most of this is stuff I don't need to cover. All right, so what kind of model would get us this evidence? Well, we could have a decentralized model, a market model, where we don't have to apply Becker's model of human capital formation with the social planner from above. A market equilibrium will give us this. If we have single crossing in the productivity of educational resources and ability, students maximize their return on educational investments, they're insensitive to arbitrary features, and they're fully informed and not liquidity constrained, we will actually get an equilibrium. That's the single crossing for a decentralized market. We will get an equilibrium in which student choices and market forces generate this assortatively matched allocation where students with higher ability are paired with more educational resources, and we end up sort of getting the results of the Becker model without any sort of social planner coming down from above. Okay, so I don't need to discuss that. Okay, so let's now discuss, since we only have a minute left, let's discuss what are the implications of this. So number one is that there must be not just single crossing, in other words, that cross partial derivative is positive, but single crossing must be very strong. Why? Because we saw that students could get 10 times the educational resources in higher education as some other students and have the same average productivity. 10 times, that's an order of magnitude, right? $100,000 versus $10,000, and the average productivity is the same. That's actually a very strong result. That surprised me a great deal when I saw it for the first time. Kind of didn't believe it for a while, and eventually I decided I believed it because that's what the data said. But it suggests that to make its maximum contribution to growth, the higher education sector would allow educational resources to scale up quite a lot with cognitive skill. Okay, that it may be nice to give everyone the same educational resources, but that is not what is going to maximize economic growth. Because when people make optimal education investments, the education investments are very different for people with different incoming levels of cognitive skill. This is probably especially an important result in highly developed economies where a lot of the jobs are demand high cognitive skills. But notice that nothing in the human capital model says anything about relative ability. It doesn't say that we can't all be of high ability. It sort of says, yes, sure, we can all be of high ability. We can all have high levels of cognitive skill, in which case all of us should invest in a lot of educational resources. That's perfectly fine in the human capital model. There is nothing at all that says we should ration educational resources and only give them to the top 5% regardless of how cognitively skilled the bottom 5% are. If everyone is cognitively skilled, everyone should get this level of educational resources. All right, so that's strong single crossing. Currently, I think we can just go out and observe in the world that not all adults appear to have very strong cognitive skills, at least by the time they reach higher education. So if ability is fixed, as Becker thought it was, and many economists have assumed it is, then we really are in a bit of a bind, or it could be just predetermined. What is good for economic growth is sort of letting educational resources scale up with cognitive skill, but that is going to be very bad for income equality, right? We'll end up with some people who have lots of educational resources and lots of cognitive skill, lots of human capital. We'll have some people with low cognitive skill, low educational resources, not very much human capital. That doesn't sound like a very equal society, right? Okay, we're going to need to do a lot of redistribution. And thus, we should feel some sense of urgency at the end of this lecture about figuring out whether ability or cognitive skill is plastic or whether it is fixed and predetermined. Okay? And if it is plastic, how can we affect it? And how can we make productive investments, not just in human capital, but also in cognitive skill, which is one of the inputs, or into ability, which is one of the key inputs into education. So that is the next lecture. The next lecture, we're going to be talking a little bit about neuroscience and what we can learn, what we can test about how we can raise cognitive skills or abilities potentially for a much larger share of the people than we do now. Thank you.